"You're coming with me," said the lone rancher after her in-laws took off all her clothes. The storm had rolled over the plains that night, wind howling like the cry of a wounded beast. In the heart of that storm, a young woman stood trembling, her spirit nearly broken by the cruelty of those who should have protected her. Her in-laws had stripped her not only of her dignity, but of her very place in their household, casting her out under the open sky as though she were nothing more than a burden. Her body shivered in the cold, but it was her heart that ached most, betrayed, abandoned, humiliated. She had no shelter, no kin, no voice left to cry for mercy. And yet, she did not fall. She stood, even as the storm lashed against her, even as shame threatened to swallow her whole. From the darkness came the steady rhythm of hooves, a sound that cut through the storm like a promise. The lone rancher rode forward, a tall figure with a broad hat pulled low, his coat heavy with rain but his posture unshaken. His horse's breath steamed in the cold night as he dismounted, boots sinking into the mud. His eyes fell upon her, and for a moment, he saw not only her suffering but the fire that still glowed faintly beneath it. She tried to cover herself, tried to hide the cruelty done to her, but his voice, low and steady, stopped her trembling. "You're coming with me," he said, not as a command, but as a vow that could not be broken. When his coat wrapped around her, it was more than warmth, it was a shield against the night and all its ghosts. She felt the weight of it on her shoulders and the strength of his presence beside her, and though words caught in her throat, her heart stirred with something she had nearly forgotten: safety. He lifted her gently onto his horse, his movements slow and deliberate, as though every touch was meant to remind her that she was no longer in the hands of cruelty. The storm roared around them, but she leaned against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, and for the first time since her world had crumbled, she let her eyes close in trust. His ranch lay miles away, but each hoofbeat carried her further from the cruelty she had endured and closer to something she could not yet name. The mountains loomed in the distance, snow-tipped and silent, and the wide plains stretched endlessly under the stars that began to pierce through the storm's retreating clouds. She lifted her gaze once, the sky vast and eternal, and wondered if perhaps God himself had sent this man when all else had failed her. The rancher said little, yet his silence spoke louder than 1,000 promises. He was a man who meant what he said, and when he had told her she was coming with him, it had not been a moment's pity but a decision carved deep into his soul. When dawn broke over the land, the ranch stood waiting, its fences stretched wide, its fields kissed by morning light. He lifted her down as though she were fragile, though he knew from her eyes that she had survived storms fiercer than most men could endure. Inside, he stoked a fire, set bread on the table, and left her space to breathe. Yet she could feel the weight of his gaze, not of judgment, but of recognition. He had seen suffering before, in cattle driven to exhaustion, in men broken by the wilderness, but never had he seen such strength carried in silence as he saw in her. She had been stripped of everything, but she had not let them take her spirit. As the days passed, the ranch became more than a shelter. It became a place where wounds could begin to heal. He did not press her for words, yet he gave her every reason to find her voice again. She walked the fields, feeling the earth solid beneath her bare feet, and with each sunrise, the humiliation forced upon her began to fade like mist before the sun. He rode out each day, working the land with the steady hands of a man who asked nothing more than to keep what was his safe, and though he said little, every glance, every small gesture reminded her of the night he had found her. He had not pitied her. He had claimed her with honor, giving back what others had stolen. She began to see him differently, not just as the man who had rescued her, but as the one who stood alone against storms and silence, carrying burdens without complaint. He had no family to call his own, no one waiting at his table, no voice to greet him when the long day ended. He had chosen solitude, yet when he found her cast out into the night, he had not hesitated to shatter his own walls. And in the quiet strength of his presence, she began to realize that perhaps she had been given more than a second chance at life, Perhaps she had been given the chance to belong in a way she never had before. The land was harsh, the nights long, the days heavy with labor, but together they carried the weight. The scar of betrayal did not vanish overnight, but the more she stood beside him, the more she felt herself restored. In the silence of the ranch, in the steady rhythm of his work, in the way he looked at her as if she were whole and untarnished, she found something stronger than survival. She found a bond forged not in words, but in action, in the unyielding truth of a man who had given her back her dignity with the simple, unbreakable vow spoken on a storm-lit night. You're coming with me. The night was cruel, the kind that seemed to swallow breath and hope alike. The wind cut sharp across the plains, rattling dry branches and whipping the dirt into clouds that stung against the skin. In the center of that merciless night stood a woman who had already lost more than the storm could ever take. Her in-laws had cast her out, and not with the harsh words of quarrel or the cold silence of dismissal, but with a humiliation that could crush even the strongest spirit. They had taken from her not only the roof over her head but the very clothes from her body, stripping her of dignity as though she were less than human, a burden undeserving of compassion. They had left her trembling in the dirt, exposed to the eyes of the world and to the bite of the storm, her soul battered more fiercely than her body ever could be. She clutched at herself, her arms crossing over her chest as the cold tore into her, but no shivering could hide the raw wound of betrayal. She had once believed that marriage tied her into family, that vows meant sanctuary, that kin by marriage could be trusted. But now she knew better. She was alone, abandoned, humiliated, discarded like refuse. Her breath came ragged, her tears dried by the merciless wind before they even reached her chin. Yet she stood upright, even if her knees shook, for something inside her would not allow them to see her crawl. The night stretched on, until the sound of hooves broke through the storm's hollow cry. It was steady, unhurried, the sound of someone who did not bend to the violence of the land but moved through it with command. From the shadows, a figure emerged on horseback, a lone rancher, broad-shouldered beneath a weathered coat, his hat pulled low against the gale. His horse snorted, breath steaming in the frigid air, but the man sat tall, his presence carved sharp against the storm. When his gaze fell on her, there was no hesitation, no flicker of uncertainty. He saw what had been done, the cruelty painted across her trembling body, the shame forced upon her like a brand. But he did not look at her as though she were ruined. He looked at her as though she still mattered. He swung down from his saddle, his boots sinking into the mud, and stepped toward her. She flinched, instinct telling her to hide, to cover what could not be covered, but his voice came low and steady, like a rope thrown across a rushing river. "You're coming with me," he said. Not a question, not a suggestion, a vow. The weight of those words settled on her shoulders like the coat he draped across her. Heavy, warm, smelling faintly of leather and earth, it swallowed her trembling frame and gave back what had been stolen from her. She clutched it tight, feeling for the first time in what seemed like forever that she was not entirely exposed, not entirely abandoned. His hand did not linger, did not press, but it was firm as he guided her toward the horse. She wanted to protest, to say she had nowhere to go, nothing left, that she was broken. But when she opened her mouth, no sound came. Instead, she let him lift her, gentle but unyielding, onto the saddle. The rancher mounted behind her, his arms steady around her waist, his presence solid as the storm beat against them. She pressed her cheek against the rough fabric of his coat, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart beneath. The wind shrieked, but it could not drown that sound, that reminder of life, of strength. For the first time that night, she closed her eyes and let herself rest against someone who would not abandon her to the cold. They rode for miles through the darkness. The plains stretched endless, the earth beneath them slick with rain, but the rancher's horse never faltered. The stars began to pierce through the thinning storm, sharp and bright, as though the heavens themselves had opened their eyes to witness what cruelty men could inflict and what mercy another could give. She lifted her gaze once to that wide sky, and in the silence between hoofbeats, a thought rose unbidden. Perhaps God had not forgotten her after all. Perhaps he had sent this man, this stranger who wasted no words, to pull her from the pit when all else had abandoned her. When dawn finally spread gold across the horizon, the shape of the ranch came into view. A wide stretch of land, fences cutting across it like veins, cattle grazing in the distance, and a house that stood plain but proud against the rising light. To her, it seemed a kingdom after the night she had endured. He swung down first, then lifted her gently as though she were made of something fragile, though in her heart she knew she had endured storms fiercer than most men could imagine. Still, the tenderness of his touch made her throat tighten. He did not see her as pitiful. He saw her as someone worth saving. Inside, the fire burned low, but with a few practiced movements, he stoked it high, the warmth spreading into the room as though the walls themselves were breathing life again. He set bread and coffee on the table, said nothing of her silence, asked nothing of her pain. Instead, he gave her space, his presence steady at a distance but near enough to remind her she was not alone. Wrapped in his coat, she sat by the fire, her body thawing, her spirit still raw but flickering with a fragile light that had not been there hours before. Days passed, marked by the rhythm of ranch life. He rose before dawn, his boots carrying him into the fields, his hands steady as he worked cattle, fixed fences, carried the weight of labor without complaint. She watched him from the porch sometimes, his figure etched against the vast sky, a man carved from the land itself. He did not press her with questions or demand gratitude. Yet each night, when he returned, he made sure she had what she needed, made sure the fire was lit, and always left her with the sense that she belonged beneath that roof. Slowly, the ranch became more than a shelter. It became a place where her broken pieces could begin to find one another again. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, she stepped into the field barefoot, the grass cool against her feet, the earth solid and unyielding beneath her. She tilted her head to the sky, feeling the vastness above her, and for the first time since the night of her humiliation, her lungs filled without the weight of shame pressing against them. Behind her, she heard his footsteps, measured, heavy, unmistakable. She turned, and there he stood, sweat darkening his shirt, dust clinging to his hat, his eyes steady on hers. He didn't need to speak. In that silence, she saw something she had not expected to find in this world again: recognition. Not pity, not desire, recognition of her strength, her worth, her survival. The scar of betrayal still throbbed in her heart, but in his presence, it no longer felt like a wound that defined her. Instead, it became a mark of what she had endured and risen above. He had taken her in not out of charity, but because something in her spirit had spoken to something in his. He had lived long with solitude, with the silence of empty rooms and the vastness of land that answered no man back. Yet the night he had found her, something had shifted. He had not let her remain broken in the mud, because he was not the kind of man who turned away from what mattered. And so, in the quiet strength of his presence, she began to wonder if the night of her greatest humiliation might also be the night her life had truly begun again. The days lengthened into weeks, and with them came a slow healing that neither of them spoke of, but both could feel. She had arrived at the ranch stripped of dignity, wounded by betrayal, yet the silence of the land and the steady presence of the man who had taken her in began to stitch her soul back together. He never asked her to explain what had been done to her, never demanded that she relive the cruelty. Instead, he gave her the gift of ordinary days. Bread shared in the morning, the creak of the barn doors opening, the hum of wind against the grasslands at dusk. Each small rhythm of life became a balm, steady and unbroken, something her spirit had long hungered for. But silence alone could not hold forever. One evening, after the cattle had been driven into the pasture and the sun bled deep crimson across the horizon, she stood in the doorway of the house, her frame outlined by the fading light. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. "Why did you stop for me that night?" The words were soft, but they carried the weight of all she had endured, all the doubts that gnawed at her heart. He paused, resting a hand against the saddle he had just set aside, his eyes steady on hers. "Because leaving you there wasn't an option," he said simply. "No poetry, no flourish, just truth spoken from the depth of a man who carried no lies in him." And in that moment, she realized that his strength was not in grand gestures but in the unshakable certainty of his choices. When he gave his word, it was carved into stone. The following morning, she rose before him and stepped into the kitchen. For weeks he had carried the burden of both ranch and hearth, never asking her to lift more than she could bear. But now, she kneaded the dough with her own hands, set the coffee to boil, and when he came in from the fields, he found her waiting with bread warm from the oven. He paused, his hat still in his hand, the faintest flicker of surprise in his eyes. She saw then that for all his strength, he too was unaccustomed to someone standing in his home as though they belonged there. She smiled faintly, and in return, something softened in his gaze, a silent acknowledgement that her place at the table was no longer temporary. The land was not gentle, and neither was life upon it. Storms came without warning, cattle strayed into danger, fences broke, and predators prowled the edges of the fields. Yet through every hardship, she found herself at his side, her strength growing in the shadow of his. She carried water, gathered wood, learned to mend wire and tend to the animals. Each task built upon the last, not only teaching her the rhythm of ranch life but showing her that she was not helpless, not ruined, not dependent upon pity. She was alive, and with each passing day, she began to claim her place in a world that had once tried to cast her aside. It was during one of those storms that the bond between them was sealed. The rain lashed against the roof, the wind tore at the walls, and a cry rose from the barn where a calf had been born too soon, struggling for life. Without hesitation, he lit the lantern and strode into the storm. She followed, her feet sinking into the mud, the rain soaking her to the bone, but she would not let him face it alone. Together, they fought for the small life in the straw, wrapping it, warming it, urging it to breathe. Hours passed before the calf's first weak cry broke through the thunder. They sat side by side, mud and sweat streaking their faces, the tiny creature nestled between them. He glanced at her then, and though no words were spoken, she saw it in his eyes, that he did not see her as a guest or a burden. He saw her as a partner. As seasons turned, the scar of betrayal that had once defined her became nothing more than a shadow of memory. The shame forced upon her by her in-laws lost its grip, replaced by the strength she found each day beneath his roof and in his company. Yet she never forgot that night, never forgot the cruel laughter that had cast her into the dirt. And when whispers of her in-laws reached the town, when she heard that they still mocked her name, she feared the weight of it might fall upon him. But the rancher was a man of few words and steady hands, and when one bold soul dared to sneer in his presence, he cut the words down with nothing more than a glance. "She's mine," he said simply, and the silence that followed carried more power than any fist. For the first time, she knew what it meant to be claimed not as property, but as someone fiercely defended. One night, beneath the open sky heavy with stars, she found herself sitting beside him on the porch. The silence stretched between them, warm and unbroken, until at last she spoke. "That night you found me, I thought it was the end of me. But it was the beginning, wasn't it?" He turned his head, his eyes steady, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It was the beginning," he said. His hand brushed against hers then, not demanding, not forcing, but steady as the land itself. She let her fingers entwine with his, and in that simple act, the past fell away. The ranch was no longer a place she had been taken to, it was her home. The man who had spoken the words "You're coming with me" was no longer a stranger. He was her anchor, her companion, the one who had lifted her from the ashes of shame and given her back her life. Together they faced the endless stretch of plains, the rising and falling of seasons, the storms and the harvests. Together they carried burdens that would have broken them apart but bound them stronger when shared. And though neither spoke much of love in words, it lived in the silence between them, in the work of their hands, in the fire that never failed to burn warm in their home. For love, they both knew, was not in fleeting declarations or fragile promises. It was in the unshakable vow spoken on a night of storm and despair, a vow that had carried her from darkness into light. "You're coming with me." Those words had saved her once, and in the years to come, they became the unspoken truth that bound them forever.